The wind outside howled with a slow, grinding moan, muffled by the insulation panels Rodney had reinforced just 3 weeks ago. Even so, a draft still crept in along the seams. Sector 6 had dropped another 5 degrees in the last 2 hours. The heater was doing its best, coughing out faint warmth from the narrow floor vent, but the battery levels were critical again. Rodney knelt beside the wall panel, fingers probing the exposed wiring with quiet efficiency. The charge from the salvaged solar tiles hadn't held. One panel must have failed under the snow weight. He sighed and flicked the water purifier switch off. Better to conserve what little power remained for heat. Dehydration was slower than freezing. The shelter was silent. Not the comforting silence of solitude, but the kind that pressed inward, heavy with stillness. Rodney was used to it, preferred it, even. People talked too much, wanted things, took more, left less. He'd tried once years back to help a family from a collapsed relay station. They'd lasted 5 days before the father tried to steal his stove coil. He hadn't opened the door for anyone since. He stood slowly, cracked his knuckles, turned toward the single induction plate near the corner. A small pot of mushroom broth simmered quietly. It wasn't much, just rehydrated spore cubes and a hint of protein, but it would keep him warm tonight. Then it happened. 3 knocks, not a gust. Not debris.knuckles.measured.intentional. Rodney froze. His eyes darted to the door-thick composite. Steel salvaged from a transport hatch, sealed at the frame. No one should be outside, not in this cold. Not here. A second knock. Closer this time. Against the primary hatch, not the external shield. Deliberate. He moved cautiously, grabbed the pry bar from the corner, and stepped toward the panel. His fingers hovered over the release. Outside temp read -22 Celsius. Anyone out there unprotected wouldn't last long. He released the external seal just enough to peer through the slat. A figure leaned heavily into the frame. Tall. Female, wrapped in a gray cloak crusted with frost. The fabric was peeling at the edges, stuck to her shoulders where ice had fused into the seams. Her head tilted slightly, revealing skin violet in tone. Mottled with blotches near the collar. Her arms cradled something. A child, small, wrapped tight, against her chest. Rodney's breath hitched. The girl's legs were bare, her feet swollen, bruised. Purple. Too purple. The woman spoke. Her voice was flat, practiced, not pleading, not shaking. Just surviving. Just one hot meal for my daughter. I'll be yours tonight. Rodney didn't respond. His mind spun. Trap? Diversion? What if she dropped right there? What if the girl stopped breathing before he made up his damn mind? But her eyes didn't waver. She wasn't begging. She was bargaining like someone who didn't expect kindness, only terms. He pulled the hatch open, not wide, just enough. Get in. She moved without hesitation, stepping inside with the child tight against her. The cold clung to them like plastic. Rap. Rodney resealed the door, twisted the valve to max out the heat flow. It would drain power fast, but he'd deal with that later. The woman dropped to her knees and placed the girl beside the vent. The child didn't cry, just blinked slowly, dazed. Rodney grabbed a thermal blanket and handed it to her. Wrap her feet first. She nodded once, no questions. She peeled back the soaked tunic, revealing frail, discolored skin. Her hands rubbed warmth into the girl's ankles, gently, skillfully. A practiced ritual. Rodney filled a cup with broth. He brought it to them, careful not to spill. Small sips. He said. The woman didn't drink. She spooned the liquid to the girl's lips. The child swallowed. Rodney exhaled. Name's Rodney. He said. The woman didn't look up. 9, she replied. My daughter's name is Kay. He nodded. That was enough for now. They weren't bait. They were just breaking. Rodney didn't sleep that night, not from discomfort. The cot was warm enough. Not from fear. He had sealed the hatch, reset the perimeter ping loop, and double-checked the motion detector, but the silence wasn't the kind that lulled him. It was the kind that listened back. Across the shelter, Nine sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, her daughter curled tightly against her ribs beneath the blanket. The child had stopped shivering. That was either a good sign or a very bad one. He could still see her feet wrapped now, but etched in his memory. Swollen, black around the toes. The kind of cold that didn't forgive. The kind that took. He sat upright, watching the heater's orange glow flicker across the curved wall. The stove's soft hum was steady, but the silence between the sounds was deafening. Every few seconds, Rodney's gaze shifted to the girl, searching for the rise of her chest. Still breathing. Still there. Just before dawn, Nine spoke. She hasn't spoken in 11 months. Her voice was barely audible, and for a moment Rodney thought he imagined it. Then she continued, still not looking at him. Last winter, there was a breach in our sector. An ammonia leak. Kay was in the common crawl space, playing with the other kids. The alarm didn't go off. The air turned before the grid caught it. Rodney sat still, listening. She got out. The others didn't. They said her scream saved 2 adults, but she hasn't made a sound since. Rodney didn't know what to say to that. He never did when people offered pieces of pain like that. It wasn't a thing to be solved. Just heard. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Nine finally turned her head toward him. Her face was unreadable. No tears, no trembling lip. Just a steady, exhausted quiet. You didn't ask why we came here. Rodney shifted slightly on the cot. Didn't feel like I had the right. She considered that. Most men want the story before they open the door, or after. They want the reason, the currency, the leverage. Rodney looked at the child again. The only story I needed was her feet. Nine's eyes narrowed just slightly, not suspicious, just appraising. That's either the kindest thing anyone said in months, or the dumbest. Rodney cracked a dry smile. Might be both. Nine lay back slowly, her arm around Kay, eyes still on him. We were in Settlement 1-2A, waterline froze. Power relay stripped for parts. The command unit reassigned resources. Those with unregistered dependents weren't eligible for full rations. They said we didn't contribute, that we were inefficient. Rodney felt something deep in his chest tighten. He'd heard similar words before. Cold words dressed up like policy. Phrases like non-essential, logistically burdensome, or worse, untracked biomass. It wasn't survival anymore. It was math. And people like Nine and Kay didn't factor into the equations anymore. He stood and walked to the workbench, pulled out a heat wrap and a second thermal pad. He laid them down beside his cot. You two can sleep here next time. The floor drains warmth. Nine didn't argue. She didn't say thank you either. That Rodney appreciated. Not everything. Had to be a transaction. By midday, the shelter had warmed enough for Kay to uncurl. She still didn't speak, but she watched. Her eyes followed every movement Rodney made. Every time he adjusted the battery panel, wiped the condensation from the inner walls, or stirred the broth, she was watching. Silently cataloging. Nine moved. 2, but efficiently. She cleaned the floor panel without being asked. Sorted the used rags into drying racks. She even rerouted a charge coil under the vent plate when it started to flicker. You worked mining systems, right? Rodney asked while checking the power readout. Subsurface scanning, utility routing. I was lead for line 7 before it collapsed. Then you already know this module is hanging by a thread. Nine shrugged. I knew it before I stepped inside. Rodney paused, then said, still chose to knock. Better the thread than the cold. That night, as the shelter dimmed into its power-save glow, Nine stepped away from the heater and sat near his cot again. Not beside it, near, close enough to speak. Far enough to retreat. She pulled off the outer layer of her cloak. Underneath, her utility jumpsuit was worn nearly transparent in places. The sleeves were wrapped in patched layers, but the lower half clung tight, warped from moisture, exposure, and wear. She sat cross-legged and pulled the blanket over her lap. "I said I'd be yours," she murmured, "but you haven't looked at me once." Rodney stirred the broth slowly. "I looked." "Then why haven't you asked?" "Because you're not here for that. You're here for her." Nine leaned her head back against the curved wall, her eyes unreadable in the low light. "That's the second kindest thing I've heard in months," she said. Rodney stood, grabbed a small teapot, and poured 2 cups. "No herbs, just warm water." He handed her one. "You can still do something." "What?" He gestured to the cot. "Drink tea. Sit beside me. Nothing else." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she stood, crossed the short space, sat beside him. Their shoulders didn't touch. Not yet, but the silence was warmer now, and when Kay shifted in her sleep, she didn't cry. She hummed soft and tuneless, barely audible over the heater's low breath. Rodney didn't say anything, but inside something unfamiliar began to bloom. Hope, maybe, or the memory of it. 3 days. That's how long it took for the silence inside the shelter to change. Not disappear, just shift. Subtle at first. Less like absence, more like breath. A rhythm had started to form. Not routine. Not quite safety. But something close. Rodney woke each morning before light, just as the heater dropped into conservation mode. The chill returned to the walls by then, creeping up from the floor tiles and curling along the vents. His first task was always the same: check the charge, rotate the solar intake feed, relight the water filament. Then he cooked enough broth for 3. He hadn't done that in years. Kay had started moving more, no longer curled into herself like a withered leaf. She still didn't speak, but she watched everything, sharp, calculating, silent. Her small fingers traced patterns in the condensation film that collected on the inner window panel, then quickly erased them with her palm when she noticed anyone looking. At night, she hummed under her breath, almost inaudibly. The notes had no tune, no real melody, just the faint repetition of remembered lullabies, pieces of songs lost to memory but not emotion. Nine noticed it too. She never interrupted. She just listened, and Rodney listened to both. Each sound reminded him that someone else was alive in the room. Alive, and not planning to leave. On the 4th day, he found a packet of old fabric straps in one of his unopened storage crates, thermal weave, strong enough to wrap and insulate. He laid them beside the cot without comment. When Nine saw them, her hands hesitated. Then, without asking, she took them, fitted them around Kay's feet, layered over the patched socks, and tied them gently. Kay didn't resist. She looked up at her mother once, then glanced at Rodney. Still watching, still measuring. That night, Nine sat beside him again. This time, she leaned her shoulder against his. Rodney didn't flinch. He didn't speak either. She sighed, soft, and said, "I waited for you to change." Rodney raised an eyebrow. "Change? Most do. After a few nights, after warmth, after trust, they start to expect." Rodney didn't respond right away. He sipped his tea. Then he said, "I expect you to keep helping with the vent coil. You did good work." That made her chuckle, dry and brief, but real. She shook her head. "If I'd met you 6 months ago, I wouldn't have believed a word you said." Rodney glanced at her. "And now?" Nine didn't answer. But she didn't move away either. The next day, the quiet broke. It came with the wind carrying with it a faint echo A crunch of snow outside. Footsteps. Rodney froze at the stove, ladle in hand. 9 turned her head sharply. She was all ready. Standing. K had stopped humming. She slipped soundlessly beneath the cot. Rodney set down the ladle and crossed the room to the control panel. The external sensor had tracked movement within 10 meters. Not approaching directly. Skirting the edge of the alley. He flipped the monitor feed. A man, tall human, wrapped in a gray reclamation jacket, collar tagged. Not a looter. Not a scavenger. Worse. Civil. Reclamation oversight. Rodney watched in silence as the man stopped mid-alley and looked up. Right at the shelter. He didn't knock, didn't call out, just looked. Then walked on. Rodney kept watching the feed until the figure vanished around the corner. Only then did he speak. He saw our footprints. 9 didn't look surprised. He doesn't need to knock. She sat slowly, jaw tight. Not fear. Something colder. Memory. Rodney looked at her. You've dealt with them before. I've seen what happens when they stop knocking. Rodney sat beside her, fists curled in his lap. I've got 6 solar tiles, a jury-rigged heater, and a cot I cut in half to make room. I don't have papers. I don't have a bond ID. I've been off-grid since the freeze. You'll be. Mark now, 9 said softly. They'll log the location. Might wait, might not. Depends on how bored they are. Rodney glanced at the girl. K was still beneath the cot. Her wide eyes stared through the darkness, not crying, not blinking. Crawled beside her. She flinched. Then stopped. He knelt low and whispered, He's not coming in. I won't let him. K blinked. No words. But she nodded so faint it was barely visible. That night, 9 stood at the wash basin, steam rising around her. She peeled off the outer layer of her jumpsuit, exposing violet skin now flushed with it. Warmth, no longer sickly pale. Rodney didn't stare, but he looked. This time, she didn't mind. She spoke while washing, voice low. He said once that I was only alive because no one had used me up yet. That was before the sector froze. Rodney said nothing. I told him I wasn't for use. I was for survival. He said that was worse. Rodney finally asked, was he Kay's father? 9 paused. Turned off the mist valve. No, he just thought. He owned things. Rodney handed her a towel. She took it, hand steady now. You don't owe me anything, he said. She looked at him. Quiet, steady. I know. She stepped toward him, slowly. One hand touched his chest, not to claim, not to tease. Just to feel that he was there. Rodney didn't move away. You can stay. He whispered. 9 didn't smile, but she didn't step back either. They sat. Together that night, not speaking, as the snow outside began to fall again. Heavy and thick, burying tracks, burying old names, burying the space between strangers who were no longer strangers. Inside, the heater kept humming, and in the dark, Kay began to hum again too. By the 8th day, Rodney noticed something he hadn't dared hope for. Kay stood, not long, not steadily, but she stood. Her frostbitten feet, wrapped in makeshift thermal cloth and salvaged insulation tape, were still fragile, but they held her weight for more than a few seconds. She braced herself against the wall near the heat vent, her small hands pressed flat to the metal as she balanced. Awkwardly. Rodney didn't say anything. 9 didn't either, but her hand hovered protectively near her daughter's side, just in case. Later that evening, after Kay drifted to sleep bundled beneath 3 layers of cloth, 9 finally let her guard down. Not all at once. Not with tears or confessions, but with presence. She sat close to Rodney, not out of necessity, but comfort. Her thigh brushed his. Her head rested, unannounced, against his shoulder as they watched the stove coil glow soft orange in the low light. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her body at last was beginning to uncoil. Rodney didn't move, didn't shift away. He let the moment settle, and something within him shifted too. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting to outlast the world. He felt like someone inside of it again. You know, Nine whispered eventually, before the collapse, I lived in communal housing. Group F, Settlement Grid 3. Rodney nodded slowly, eyes still on the heater. They gave you a cot, a locker, and a badge. You weren't assigned family, but you were assigned relationships. Who you could eat with, who you could work beside, who you could speak to during your 10-minute meal window. Rodney finally turned to look at her. Sounds less like housing, and more like a holding pen. Nine gave a dry chuckle. That's what it was. Polished concrete, dull lighting, recycled air. People weren't people. They were logistics. What happened? They logged me as condition compromised after Kay was born. No partner, no Tier 5 badge. Just a mouth to feed and no production credit. Rodney felt his hands curl. So they cut you loose. They gave me 2 weeks to recover. Then revoked my ration status and reassigned me to utility labor. I took whatever shifts kept her nearby. Rodney didn't reply. There were no words adequate for that kind of engineered cruelty. Nine looked toward the cot. She used to laugh, she said. Not often, but enough. Sometimes she'd mimic the flicker of the terminal screen and giggle, or hum along to the fan pulses. They were songs to her. Rodney looked at her. She will again. Nine's eyes lifted. Met his. She? Might. But if she laughs, she'll get attached. And if she gets attached, she'll forget how temporary this is. Rodney shook his head slowly. Not everything ends in winter, Nine smiled faintly. Everything does eventually. Just depends on how long you pretend it's still fall. Rodney stood, walked across the room, and opened one of the sealed supply crates. He pulled out a thermal tunic oversized, but clean, and knelt beside the cot. K was half asleep, one foot curled under the other. He gently laid the tunic across her, tucking it around her shoulders. She's not going back to cold, he said. Nine watched him from across the room, her expression unreadable. When she spoke again, it was quieter than before. She doesn't speak, not even to me, but she hums sometimes. When she thinks no one's listening, Rodney nodded. She knows someone's listening now. That night, as the snow thickened outside, the silence shifted again. Kay hummed under her breath. Rodney stirred broth at the stove. And Nine, still watching, slowly reached over and placed her hand on his. It wasn't a test. It wasn't an offer. It was trust. They didn't say anything, but that silence? It wasn't empty. It was full. The next morning brought sunlight, thin and pale, barely cutting through the gray overcast, but it was there. Rodney opened the hatch just enough to check the exterior tiles. Snow drifted in. Cold, yes, but not biting. The worst of the storm had passed. Inside, Kay sat cross-legged on the floor with a piece of flattened synth paper and a charcoal stick. She was drawing something, awkward lines and half-formed shapes. Rodney didn't recognize them until he saw it. 3 figures. One small, one taller with a cloak, one broad-shouldered. Standing between, Rodney's hand paused on the kettle. Nine approached slowly, saw the drawing. Didn't speak. Rodney said, She's drawing us. Nine nodded. She is. Before he could answer, a sharp buzz broke the quiet. Rodney's eyes darted to the wall panel. Motion sensor. Nine was already moving. She pulled Kay close, cloaking the drawing with her sleeve. Rodney moved to the screen. One figure. Alone. Human. Wearing a coat with a badge tag. Civil reclamation. Again. This time, he was standing still, facing the shelter directly. He didn't knock. Just waited. Nine's voice was steel behind him. They logged us. We're flagged now. Rodney stared at the screen. No, he said. They're testing us, seeing if we'll answer. Kay clung tighter to her mother. Rodney turned, walked to the door, stopped with his hand over the latch. Then he looked at 9. I'm not hiding you. Her eyes flickered. But what if they don't ask? Rodney's voice didn't waver. Then I'll tell them anyway. The knock came at dusk. Not loud, not frantic, but deliberate. 2 precise taps against the outer panel, measured, controlled. Trained. Rodney was sealing a fracture along the north-facing wall when he heard it. He paused mid-motion, hand still. Smeared with adhesive compound, heart already ticking faster. The noise didn't echo like wind. It didn't creak like metal strain. It was human. And it was timed. Like someone delivering bad news who had done it many times before, 9 heard it too. She was kneeling at the wash basin, drying Kay's hair with a warm cloth after their shared rinse. The girl had begun letting her mother touch her again, without flinching, without recoiling. That alone had taken a week of heat and stillness and silence. And now, just as her eyes had started to lose their haunted sheen, the sound came again. Rodney wiped his hands quickly and moved to the control panel. He didn't open the door. Not yet. He activated the external lens, flipping to full spectrum, and muted the interior lights. Outside stood a man, mid-30s, gray jacket, reclamation badge on the collar. Not enforcement yet, not military, but close. Just one layer above the men who carried restraint cables. Rodney toggled audio. The man looked directly into the lens. Resident 47D, he said with the slow patience of someone reading from a protocol list. We've had a non-scheduled supply delivery routed to this sector. Registry flag triggered. Standard anomaly review. Mind if we come in? Rodney's heart skipped. He toggled a second lens side angle, wide view. Only one figure? A bluff? A test? His finger hovered over the talk button. Then he pressed it. This isn't a distribution hub. No one lives here but me. The officer didn't blink. That's the record. Still, protocol requires visual confirmation. You understand. Behind Rodney, Kay had already crawled under the cot. No one told her. She didn't need to be told. 9 stepped silently to the wall's edge, shadows folding around her like armor. Her jumpsuit was zipped, her face dry, hair tied back. Ready. Rodney stared at the monitor. Every instinct in him said, don't open it. But 9 was watching. So was Kay, and so was the man outside, waiting to see if the shelter would hide or speak. Rodney pressed the latch. The outer door hissed open with a rush of frigid air. The officer stepped forward. He was younger than Rodney, his boots too clean for someone who'd been on foot for long. He didn't smell like snow. He smelled like the inside of a heated vehicle. His eyes swept the interior, heater, stove, panels. Then they stopped on 9. She didn't move, didn't avert her gaze, didn't shrink. The officer gestured vaguely. You're cohabitant? Rodney's jaw tightened. Yes. Registered with sector housing? Rodney didn't blink. Doesn't need to be. We're bonded. The man's brow arched. Documentation? Not required. I claimed her. Silence stretched. Not long. But heavy. Then the officer's gaze flicked lower, to the floor, to the small cot. The shoes beside it. The thermal tunic folded near the vent. Child? He asked, without pointing. Rodney said nothing. The man looked back to 9. His voice was cooler now. Sir, non-registered inhabitants, particularly minors, are grounds for shelter reclassification. If you're sheltering an unlogged dependent, especially from an off-grid sector, Rodney stepped forward. Not hostile, but firm. I'm not under relief. I stopped accepting grid credits 6 months ago. This shelter's off-grid, self-sustained. No consumption report. No ration draw. Another pause. The officer's eyes narrowed. Recalculating. Rodney didn't flinch. Eventually, the officer nodded. Once, not agreement, not acceptance. Just acknowledgement. We'll mark this as a verbal dispute. No further visit unless flagged. He turned to go. At the hatch threshold, he stopped. Glanced back. Just a word of advice, sir. Rodney waited. Neighbors talk. This sector might be quiet, but quiet doesn't mean blind. Then he was gone. Rodney resealed the hatch, one hand still on the latch. Behind him, Kay crawled from beneath the cot. She didn't ask. Didn't cry. Rodney knelt down. He's not coming back, he said softly. She stared at him. Then, in a voice so small it almost disappeared, she whispered, "Okay." It was the first word she'd spoken in nearly a year. Rodney looked up. 9 was already kneeling beside them, one hand on Kay's back, one on Rodney's shoulder. And something passed between them. Not heat. Not silence. Something firmer. A choice. Rodney stood that night by the heater, alone for a moment, before 9 came and placed her hand against his back. She didn't speak. Neither did he, but when they lay down, she pulled him with her. And when her lips touched his, it wasn't apology. It was anchor. Not desire born from desperation, but connection carved from survival. The world outside hadn't changed, but inside, the cold wasn't in control anymore. It was them. Together. Rodney didn't open the door for the next 3 days. He didn't need to. Whatever message the reclamation officer meant to deliver had already arrived. No warning lights, no follow-up ping, no second knock. But that didn't mean they were safe. That meant they'd been seen. And when the system saw you, it didn't always act immediately. Sometimes it watched, waited, measured, gave you just enough time to start hoping before it cut that hope off at the root. Rodney spent those days reinforcing the seals, tightening the thermal piping beneath the floor grid, and recalibrating the solar charge relay. He barely slept. Not because of fear, but because vigilance had become its own form of rest, an action that required no trust, only habit. Inside the shelter, something else had shifted. 9 didn't hover. She moved through the space like she belonged to it. Now. Not carefully, not cautiously, but with quiet ownership. She rewrapped the storage crates in insulation cloth. She cleaned and reassembled the emergency wash station, even fixing a sputtering valve with resin from a cracked supply kit. She didn't ask permission. Rodney didn't give it. He didn't need to. Every morning he found her sitting at the heater, cross-legged, braiding her own hair while Kay drew on scraps of flattened packaging material circles, figures, sometimes patterns Rodney didn't recognize but 9 did. They were lullaby symbols, movement songs, repetitions once sung in communal, barracks to keep rhythm during water hauling shifts. Kay still didn't speak, but she hummed now with full breath. And sometimes, when Rodney knelt beside her and handed her a warm cup of broth, she looked at him, not through him. At him. That alone felt revolutionary. On the 4th evening, Rodney stepped outside for the first time since the knock. He cleared a strip of snow away from the access path, laying down scavenged insulation plates, non-slip, half-rigid, designed for low-friction surface work. When he returned, Kay was standing at the door, fully dressed in her oversized tunic, wrapped feet fitted into the salvaged shoes. She stared through the seam of the hatch. Rodney opened it. She stepped outside. No fear, just quiet, curiosity. The sky above was a sheet of uniform gray, heavy with the threat of another storm, but not immediate. No sirens, no motion sensors. Number. Drones. Kay took 2 steps onto the insulated path. Rodney stood behind her, not guiding, not speaking. Just present. From inside. 9 watched them both, and that's when Rodney saw it. Up and to the left. A curtain on the 2nd floor of a collapsed housing unit shifted just barely. The kind of movement made by someone watching. Unsure whether to reveal themselves, Rodney didn't react, didn't point, didn't mention it. He just memorized the angle, the window, the distance. Later, inside, he pulled 9 aside while Kay drew. Another charcoal sketch near the heater. "We need to decide," he said. 9 looked at him, eyes calm but alert. "Decide what?" Rodney sat down, his voice low but steady. "Whether we keep hiding you or say it out loud." 9's face didn't change, but her body did, just a slight tension in her shoulders. "Say what?" Rodney didn't hesitate. "That you're mine. That she lives here. That this is your home." 9 stared at him, long, deep, like she was checking for cracks in his words. When she answered, it wasn't with fear, it was with something like relief. "And when they knock again?" Rodney's jaw clenched. "Then I'll open the door. And—" "I'll say it again." She didn't respond with a kiss. Not this time. She stepped into him, pressed her hands against his chest, and said quietly, "And if they don't knock? If they just take?" Rodney's answer came without hesitation. "Then I'll follow." It wasn't poetry, it was a promise. That night they lay together, no pretense, no ritual, no calculated warmth. Just the two of them beneath a shared blanket. Skin against skin, breath slow and in sync. When her hand slid under his shirt and rested over his ribs, he didn't flinch. He turned toward her, pressed his lips to her shoulder, and whispered, "Still here." 9 didn't speak, but her arms wrapped around him tighter, and they didn't let go. Outside, the world stayed cold, but inside warmth had become defiance. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were claiming something one had offered them in a long time, a life together. The snowfall didn't stop for 3 more days, not enough to collapse structures, but thick and steady, blanketing Sector 6 in the same pale hush that had once smothered the cries of dying settlements. It muffled everything. Footsteps vanished in minutes. Sounds didn't travel. Drones didn't scan. And every rooftop became indistinguishable from the next. Rodney didn't leave the shelter during that time. He didn't need to. Inside, life had become something else. Not survival. Not routine. Something warmer. Something earned. Kay now followed him from task to task, quiet, observant. Her humming filled the background like oxygen. While Rodney adjusted power conduits or wiped condensation from the walls, she would sit nearby, stacking screws by size or drawing on reused paper with charcoal. She still hadn't said much, not since OK, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the way her eyes followed him, or the way her fingers sometimes tugged lightly at the hem of his shirt when she wanted to help. What mattered was that she no longer looked at the door like it might open and take her. What mattered was that she'd begun to smile. 9 had changed too. She no longer moved like a guest, no longer checked herself before crossing the room, no longer waited for silent approval. She reorganized the drawers, calibrated the thermal timer on her own, even argued once, gently, about how Rodney stored his heat gel reserves. He'd laugh then. An honest laugh. The kind that cracked the ice in his chest. And 9 had smirked, satisfied, every night. They laid together, not for warmth, but for closeness. She curled into him without hesitation. Kay now often crept onto the cot during the coldest hours and folded herself into the curve of their bodies. They didn't push her away. They made room. Then, just after sunrise on the 4th day, a knock came again, not harsh, not loud. Just 2 quick taps measured. Familiar. Rodney moved to the hatch, flipping the lens feed. Same man, reclamation officer. But this time, he wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside him. Female. Mid-50s, draped in a plain brown coat, no rank badge. Pale face, clipboard in hand. Not enforcement. Something worse. Record-keeping. Rodney tensed. They're logging us again, he said aloud. 9 stood behind him before he even finished the sentence. Already holding Kay's hand, he opened the audio line. This isn't a violation, the officer said quickly. She's not from enforcement. She's census registry. Rodney narrowed his eyes. Census? The woman stepped forward, her voice steady but neutral. The registry has reopened. We're accepting voluntary declarations. No removals, no enforcement. Just name, location, and bond status. Voluntary. Rodney didn't move. And they stay? The woman nodded once. If declared, yes. No flags, no reviews. 9 was watching him now. Kay clutched her fingers. Rodney turned slowly, then nodded once. All right. The woman clicked her pen. Name? Nyrene, Rodney said clearly. Child? Kay. Bond. Status? Rodney didn't pause. Family. The woman wrote it down. The officer didn't flinch this time. He simply stepped back. That's all, the woman said. You're logged. No future visits. Rodney sealed the hatch, this time with purpose. When he turned, 9 was still staring at him. You believe them? She asked softly. Rodney shook his head. No, he said. But they stopped needing to doubt. That evening, he cleared space near the heater and pulled an old crate over like a makeshift table. He laid a cloth across it, then placed 3 warm bowls down. 9 sat beside him. Kay came quietly, without being called. She didn't need to look for permission anymore. Rodney handed her a spoon. She stared at the soup for a moment, then looked up. He smiled faintly. Do you like it? Kay's voice was almost inaudible, but it didn't shake. It's warm, she whispered. 9 exhaled. A sound that was not quite laughter, but not far from it either. Rodney didn't say anything more. He didn't need. 2. Later that night, after the bowls were cleaned and the shelter dimmed into its nightly hum, they lay together under the blanket, all 3 of them in the cot now widened with extra padding. 9's head rested on his chest. Kay slept with her hand between both of theirs. Outside, the snow had slowed. And in that silence, Rodney finally spoke. This is our place now. 9 didn't answer, but she pulled him closer, and her body, once tense with the constant expectation of being abandoned, finally let go. It wasn't safety. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And this time, when the world knocked, they answered, not with fear, not with surrender, but with something the cold had never been able to erase. Each other.